Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here. The idea of this book was actually partly a result of the first year I spent at Williams College, where I got to know James McGregor Burns, a Roosevelt biographer, who was then 90 years old and who was finishing a remarkable book called Packing the Court, a history of presidents, the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's role in American life. In just about 300 pages, he really produced a whole history of the U.S. from that particular perspective. And I began thinking then how it might be possible to do something similar based on presidential addresses and in particular State of the Union addresses. That idea remained on the back burner until 2020 when I was working on something else, but the pandemic hit, all the libraries were shut down, and I had to abandon my current project. I didn't need a library to do this because every presidential address has been collected at one website by the University of California at Riverside. I didn't know if the project would work. That's been true of several of my other books, but I dove in, and once I had read all the major addresses of the first 5 or so presidents and written that up, I was convinced that it would work. I'm going to talk generally about the book for a little while, and then focus on FDR, since this is the FDR library, and since the chapter about him is certainly one of the critical chapters of the book. But feel free in the question period to ask anything about any favorite president if you want. Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution states that the President shall from time to time give to the Congress information of the state of the Union and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. This was probably inspired by the tradition of the King's Speech opening Parliament in Britain, when the monarch would similarly lay out the key problems facing the nation and what ought to be done about them. The book does not tackle the addresses one by one. Here's the book. But it attacks the major issues of each administration one by one, tracing one issue after another through that whole administration. It covers a lot of ground. The first 40 years of the Republic include several direct challenges to federal authority, from the Whiskey Rebellion under Washington to the South Carolina nullification crisis under Andrew Jackson. Relations with Indian tribes figure very frequently, climaxing again in the Andrew Jackson administration. The national accounts, until recently, were a major part of every State of the Union address, with the President reporting on the surplus or the deficit and where he expected it to go in future years. For some reason, which I can't imagine, recent presidents don't get into these details anymore, which I think is very sad. The slavery issue was hardly mentioned for a long time, but starting with the Mexican War, it rapidly takes center stage, leading to the Civil War. And then Reconstruction dominates the administrations of Andrew Johnson and Ulysses S. Grant. Late in the 19th century, the power of trusts, the problem of economic equality, begin to take center stage, particularly under Theodore Roosevelt and then Woodrow Wilson. We'll talk about the issues under FDR later. Civil rights had largely fallen off the radar after Reconstruction, not completely, but largely. It was picked up again, especially by Harry Truman, who really put civil rights in the sense that we understand it on the agenda in 1948, and then it increasingly dominated presidential addresses and the business of the nation under Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson, and also, in a different way, under Nixon. Taxes have become a huge issue in the second half of the 20th century. And meanwhile, the annual messages and special messages of Madison, Polk, Lincoln, McKinley, Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Truman, Johnson, Nixon, and the 2 Bushes provide a remarkably concise guide to all the nation's wars. I learned a lot of new history reading these messages and writing this book, and I'm sure any of you will too if you look at it. Can anyone name the one president who called for the abolition of the Electoral College in every single one of his annual messages? That was Andrew Jackson. Yes. Another question, what group of Americans did U.S. Grant and several of his successors single out as a danger to our civilization because of their social and political practices? That was the Mormons in Utah Territory. No president has ever talked about any other group of Americans the way those men talked about the Mormons. And who predicted in the 1840s that New York would replace London as the financial capital of the world? That was James K. Polk, a remarkably visionary president. So that was some of the things that I came across. The overarching issue that dominates the book, though, was stated, appropriately enough, by George Washington in his first inaugural address, and I quote, "The preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly considered, perhaps, as deeply as finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. Could we make democracy work? Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, Wilson, FDR, JFK, Reagan, and others have returned to this theme again and again, often from very different perspectives. And that issue, in turn, led to the question of what would happen and what would be our role to democratic institutions in the broader world at large. At the beginning, the early presidents who mentioned this simply suggested that we were an example to the rest of the world, which they were beginning to follow. Later, we moved to making the world safe for democracy under Wilson, to defending it wherever it was threatened under Roosevelt, and in the Cold War, and in more recent days, literally to actively trying to spread democracy around the world. In general, I found the most effective presidents were the ones who could put the events of the day in the broadest possible historical context. And FDR was very definitely one of those. Let me say that I was not primarily concerned with the question of who exactly wrote these speeches. Sometimes it is the president, sometimes it is not. Or particularly concerned with the oratorical skill of the presidents, although that certainly comes out because another big part of the book was to present the history of the United States in the words of the people who actually made it and lived through it. I treated the addresses as records of American politics at that particular moment in time. And that, I think, is their enduring significance. So today, we're at the FDR Library, and FDR is as important as any other president in the book. He is one of three presidents, along with Washington and Lincoln, who have a chapter solely devoted to himself. I also do believe that no other president had a comparable impact, both at home and abroad. His impact in both cases has lasted for generations. And thus, for the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to use his own words to take us through his extraordinary 12 years in power during the great crisis of the 20th century in the 30s and 40s. And this will give you all some idea of the technique of the whole book. From the moment he took office until his death, Franklin Roosevelt showed an extraordinary ability to identify the nation's problems, to put them in a broad historical and moral context, and to propose and execute workable solutions. In his famous first inaugural, FDR began by detailing the disastrous economic state of the nation. Shrunken values, higher taxes, low government revenue at all levels, dormant industry, agriculture without markets, wiped out personal savings, and a host of unemployed. But the real problem, he said, was a moral one. Our distress comes from no failure of substance, he said. Plenty is at our doorstep, but a generous use of it languishes in the very sight of the supply. Primarily, this is because rulers of the exchange of mankind's goods have failed through their own stubbornness and their own incompetence, have admitted their failure, and have abdicated. The money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to the ancient truths. The measure of the restoration lies in the extent to which we apply social values more noble than mere monetary profit. Our greatest primary task is to put people to work. in part by direct recruiting by the government itself, treating the task as we would treat the emergency of a war. He called for higher agricultural prices, a stop to foreclosures on farms and houses, a lower cost of government, and, quote, strict supervision of banking credits and investments, all to be considered by a special session of Congress. He also threatened to ask Congress for extraordinary executive powers, if necessary, to meet the emergency, but that did not turn out to be necessary. Several fireside chats over the radio, Roosevelt's great innovation in presidential communication, in March, in May, and in July of that first year, detailed the government's responses to the problem. He mentioned the Civilian Conservation Corps, employing 250,000 men, the Tennessee Valley Authority to bring hydroelectric power and flood control to the southeast, mortgage relief, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration to raise farm prices, the National Recovery Act to make industry and labor work together, and $3 billion, a lot of money in those days, on public works. The Democrats enjoyed 313 to 117 majorities in the House and 58 to 37 in the Senate, and thus all of this sailed through very quickly. Roosevelt referred to, but discounted, the opposition to what he was doing. I have no sympathy with the professional economists who insist that things must run their course and that human agencies can have no influence on economic ills, he said. In his first annual message in January 1934, he announced that the government would target, and I quote, groups who have been living off their neighbors with unethical or criminal methods. These included tax evaders, predatory high officials of banks and corporations, speculators, bandits, common criminals, lynch mobs, and kidnappers, all lumped together in one sentence. The nation had to reconstruct our life in ways that left no room for overexpansion of industry, exploitation of labor, and the waste of natural resources. At the end of the session of Congress in late June of 1934, another fireside chat cited the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission to regulate Wall Street and the Federal Communications Commission, and hailed measurable economic progress. Acknowledging growing opposition to these steps, he said, it is not the overwhelming majority of the farmers or manufacturers or workers who deny the substantial gains of the past year. The most vociferous of the doubting Thomases may be divided roughly into two groups. First, those who seek special political privilege, and second, those who seek special financial privilege. We are restoring confidence and well-being under the rule of the people themselves, he said, contrasting the United States with other nations that had given up democracy for autocracy. Roosevelt, in short, managed not only to diagnose the nation's ills, but to get something serious done about them that affected millions of people within his first 2 years. As a result, in the 1934 congressional elections, the Democrats gained 9 more Senate seats and 14 more in the House. This is, for those of us who are Democrats, an unfortunate comparison with 1994 and 2010. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama both spent all their political capital on 1 or 2 major measures in their first 2 years. In Obama's case, the biggest measure was health care, which wasn't even going to go into effect until early in his second term. And in contrast to Roosevelt in 1934, Clinton and Obama both lost all or most of the Congress in their first midterm election and really never recovered their effectiveness after that. Roosevelt put forth new goals in the January 1935 annual message. We assert that the ambition of the individual to obtain for him and his a proper security, a reasonable leisure, and a decent living throughout life is an ambition to be preferred to the appetite for great wealth and great power. He proposed Social Security and an additional public works agency, which became the WPA. In June, he also called for higher inheritance and income taxes. The transmission from generation to generation of vast fortunes by will, inheritance, or gift is not consistent with the ideals and sentiments of the American people. Such inherited economic power is as inconsistent with the ideals of this generation as inherited political power was inconsistent with the ideals of the generation which established our government. He frequently compared the great crisis he faced to the original crisis that created the nation and also at times to the Civil War. The higher tax rates passed, and so did the Wagner Act, affirming workers' rights to organize. Meanwhile, as you know, the Supreme Court was striking down a number of these major New Deal measures. In January 1936, the annual message pointed for the first time to foreign dangers. For nearly 3 years, he said, the temper and the purposes of the rulers of many of the great populations in Europe and Asia have not pointed the way either to peace or to goodwill among men. And he linked that danger to domestic ones. Within our borders, as in the world at large, popular opinion is at war with a power-seeking minority. The danger of economic collapse had passed, he said, and the money changers who had abdicated at the time of his first inaugural forget their damaging admissions and withdraw their abdication. They seek the restoration of their selfish power. This became the theme of his re-election campaign. Opposed by 75% of the nation's newspapers, that's a fact. And in fact, it was only in 1932 that he was ever supported by a majority of them. He won 61% of the popular vote, 46 out of 48 states. And the Democrats increased their majorities still further. That was, in fact, the fourth consecutive congressional election from 1930 onward in which the Democratic Party had increased its number of seats, and that is an unprecedented record in American history. It was now, as you know, that Roosevelt made his biggest political misstep, proposing the court packing plan to add 6 justices to the Supreme Court. Eventually, the Senate rejected it by a huge majority that included a majority of the Democrats in the Senate. There were a lot of reasons for this backlash, and if you want, we can touch on that. But certainly, he had lost his magic and never completely regained it. The Congress also rejected a plan for the reorganization of the executive branch, with many claiming that Roosevelt was trying to turn himself into a dictator. Meanwhile, a severe recession struck during 1937 and lasted into 1938, undoing most of the economic progress of the first 4 years. But all was not lost. The threat of court packing, as James McGregor Burns made clear, led the Supreme Court to reverse course and to allow the Social Security Act and the Wagner Act, which were coming before it, to proceed. In addition, one justice resigned, replaced by the great Hugo Black, and that began to turn the Supreme Court in a different direction. And meanwhile, that Congress eventually, in 1938, passed another very important piece of legislation, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the act which is still the basis of our minimum wage and maximum hour provisions, amended many times since then, drastically in need of amendment now, but that's another story. It was also the act which finally and for all time outlawed child labor in the United States. By this time, foreign affairs were intruding even more. I think that Roosevelt recognized the grave danger of Hitler and the Japanese from the beginning of his term, but he kept it on the back burner for a very long time, partly because he knew that his apprehension was not widely shared. It was in October 1937 in Chicago, with civil war raging in Spain and Japan waging a cruel war with China, that Roosevelt, for the first time, warned the American people about a possible new global war. The present reign of terror and international lawlessness, he said, seriously threatened the very foundations of civilization. Let no one imagine that America will escape. There can be no stability or peace, either within nations or between nations, except under laws and moral standards adhered to by all. International anarchy destroys every foundation for peace. This is the beginning of the story that I told 10 years ago in No End Save Victory, of how FDR prepared the nation for war. That talk is still on C-SPAN, if you want to listen to that one that I gave here. and I'm going to go through the next couple of years very quickly today. The great turning point in that story came in the spring of 1940 with the fall of France and the threatened fall of Great Britain. Roosevelt immediately called for a massive expansion of the military to include a military draft for the purpose, and I think this was completely genuine, of defending the Western Hemisphere from potential threats. That was why Congress immediately agreed to double the size of the Navy as well, with almost no debate. At the turn of the year, 1940-41, he called for Lend-Lease to aid the British and other nations fighting the Axis. And then, after the German attack on the USSR in June of 1941, Roosevelt escalated his aims and asked the War Department to set production and manpower goals that would enable the U.S. in the event of war to completely defeat all its potential enemies. And that became the basis for the war planning that did exactly that. In August, meeting Churchill at the Atlantic Conference, he committed the U.S. to, quote, the destruction of the Nazi tyranny, unquote, even though we were not yet in the war. I'm going to leave this part of the story now and pick it up again where No One Save Victory left off after Pearl Harbor in January 1942. 4 issues I found dominated his major addresses from then forward. First, the strategic planning for the Second World War. Second, the domestic mobilization that the war required. Thirdly, the creation of a new post-war economy and society at home. And lastly, the planning for a new international order. In his January 1942 annual message, he listed enormous new production targets for various categories of weapons and also for ships, which he insisted would eventually allow the U.S. and its allies to win total victory over Germany and Japan. The superiority of the United Nations in munitions and ships must be overwhelming, so overwhelming that the Axis nations can never hope to catch up with it. The militarists of Berlin and Tokyo started the war, but the massed, angered forces of common humanity will finish it. Only total victory can reward the champions of tolerance and decency, freedom and faith. 6 weeks later, in a fireside chat, he acknowledged severe setbacks in the Pacific and patiently explained that the great distances involved would require a long time to build up the necessary resources for a successful offensive there. Over the next 18 months, he reported various positive developments, including the Battle of Midway in June 1942, the landings in North Africa in November of that year, the great Russian victory at Stalingrad, and the Italian surrender in the summer of 1943. And on Christmas Eve, 1943, he reported on his meeting with Churchill and Stalin at Tehran. We agreed on every point concerned with the launching of a gigantic attack upon Germany, he said, a clear reference to the coming invasion of Western Europe. And he added, the war is now reaching the stage where we shall all have to look forward to large casualty lists, dead, wounded, and missing. Meanwhile, FDR continually shared with the American people the details of the gigantic expansion of the armed forces, the vastly increased government borrowing needed to pay for it, and the need for even higher taxes. He even repeatedly tried to get through Congress a proposal to tax all income at over $25,000 a year, maybe $400,000 today, let's say, at 100%. The Congress refused to go along with that, but he kept trying. He explained that civilian consumption had to fall to make room for enormous military production, and prices had to be controlled, as they were quite successfully. But by the middle of 1943, the year before the climactic offensives began, he was shifting his focus to the post-war economy. In October of that year, he proposed a vast program to educate veterans. For many, what they desire most in the way of employment will require special training and further education. As part of a general program for the benefit of the members of our armed services, I believe that the nation is morally obligated to provide this training and education and the necessary financial assistance by which they can be secured. The GI Bill of Rights passed, in fact, shortly after D-Day. And in a radio address on November 2nd, 1944, just before his third re-election, he promised to continue economic growth after the war. I look forward to millions of new homes fit for decent living, to new low-priced automobiles, new highways, new airplanes and airports, to television and other miraculous new inventions and discoveries made during this war, which will be adapted to the peacetime uses of a peace-loving people. Our post-war job will be to work to build for a better America than we have ever known. He was, as it turned out, announcing the birth of the United States, in which we have spent our entire lives. And simultaneously, he promised a new order abroad as well. On January 1st, 1943, he promised, and I quote, to organize relations among nations so that forces of barbarism can never break loose. A year later, after Tehran, he declared, the best interests of each nation, large and small, demand that all freedom-loving nations shall join together in a just and durable system of peace. Wisely, however, he remembered the errors of his old boss, Woodrow Wilson, and he allowed senators to take the lead in securing approval for two resolutions pledging the country, quote, to cooperate in a world organization for peace. The UN founding conference was scheduled when he died. Thus we see, in these 12 years, a president who again and again laid out great objectives simply and clearly, laid out the program to achieve them, and far more often than not, actually did achieve them with the help of Congress and the enormous efforts of the whole American people. The durability of his achievements really became clear in the 1950s when his first Republican successor, Eisenhower, did not challenge any of the major new achievements of the New Deal. And then in the early 1960s, John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson explicitly built upon the New Deal legacy in very important ways. Nothing, however, lasts forever, as Franklin Roosevelt, who certainly had a keen sense of history himself, understood. Ronald Reagan, in the 1980s, bluntly renounced that legacy and set the government on a very different path. And in States of the Union, I had to show also that the words and actions of his successors, including those from the Democratic Party, showed that his influence has also outlived his presidency for a long time, and to some extent has continued to do so. I would also suggest that this incredible record of achievement at home and abroad really established a new bond between the American people and their government that lasted into the 1960s and that enabled us to go on doing great things in all sorts of areas, going to the moon, civil rights legislation, Medicare, and lots of it. But the Vietnam War began the destruction of that bomb, I think, of that bond, along with a counterattack from business interests and the Republican Party, which began to undermine the principles of the New Deal. And we are still living with that. Now, before we take questions, feeling as I do the great honor of giving this talk in this library, I want to close with two stories that to me best illustrate exactly what Franklin Roosevelt meant to his contemporary countrymen. He did not, of course, enjoy anything like universal support. I refer you to a remarkable book by George Wolfskill and John Hudson called All But the People, describing the multifaceted opposition he aroused in his first 8 years and the extraordinary campaigns of hatred that were waged against him, to no great effect. But large majorities elected him 4 times and trusted him in these great crises. And the first story I want to tell you is a newspaper account of an interview with a young congressman on April 12th, 1945, when Roosevelt had just died. In a gloomy Capitol corridor, Lyndon B. Johnson, a 36-year-old representative from Texas and a typical representative, too, of 100 formerly obscure young men whose leap into national prominence had been immeasurably aided by President Roosevelt's paternal coaching, stood with tears in his eyes tonight and said slowly, "There are plenty of us left here to try to block and run interference, as he had taught us, but the man who carried the ball is gone, gone. He was just like a daddy to me always. He always talked to me just that way. He was the one person I ever knew, anywhere, who was never afraid." I don't know that I'd ever have come to Congress if it hadn't been for him, but I do know I got my first great desire for public office because of him, and so did thousands of other young men all over the country. My own father was another one of those young men. The people who are going to be crushed by this are the little guys. The little guy down in my district, say, who makes $21.50 a week driving a truck and has a decent house to live in now, cheap, because of Mr. Roosevelt. Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn had already issued a statement. "We know not how to interpret God in the way he performs. The world has lost one of its great leaders of all time. President Roosevelt's passing will shock and sadden good people everywhere. The American nation has been well led in every crisis. In Harry Truman, we have a leader in whom I have complete confidence." Mr. Johnson stood looking at the original copy of this farewell to President Roosevelt. "God," he said, "God, how he could take it for us all." And at the same time, the same moment, the president's oldest son, James Roosevelt, a lieutenant colonel in the Marines, was leading troops in the Philippines. That morning, a young Marine came into his tent and handed him an official message. "I have something for you, sir," he said. And then the young Marine began to cry and ran out of the tent. It was the official announcement of the president's death. Several of the Roosevelt sons were serving in various parts of the world, and the others stayed where they were. But James was the oldest son, and he decided that he should try to attend his father's funeral. So he made the trip all across the Pacific and all across the United States in propeller-driven aircraft, trying to get here in Hyde Park in time for the internment. And he was not quite able to do it. He landed on Long Island just about at the moment that the internment was taking place. He reached his mother, arranged to meet her in New York later in the day, and then, as he put it in his own memoir, just began wandering around Manhattan, just another man in uniform. And then suddenly, a taxi cab pulled up alongside me. The driver leapt out, leaving his door open, and said, "My God, aren't you Jimmy Roosevelt?" I said I was. He grabbed my hand, and the words started pouring out of him, all the things Father had meant to him. Then an ugly thing happened, a thing that my whole family had learned long ago to live with, but which at this particular moment was hard to endure. The cabbie had a passenger, and he leaned out of the cab, uttered a profanity, and said, "I hired you to drive me, not to talk about that bastard Roosevelt." Long ago, I had schooled myself to put my fists in my pocket and walk away when strangers started reviling Father. That afternoon, I was able to do it once more, but I had to restrain the cab driver from assaulting his passenger. The cabbie was so angry that he couldn't talk coherently. Tears were running down his face, and he threw the man out of his cab. I guess I was crying a little too as I walked away. The directors of this library obviously still see American history the way Roosevelt and all our great presidents saw it, as a great, often heroic, sometimes tragic adventure. I'm sorry to report that neither our academic departments nowadays, nor many of our publishing houses, are inclined to see it that way any longer. But I think the record of Roosevelt and other presidents that I was able to lay out shows that that record is authentic, and I am confident that sooner or later, someday, a new president will draw on history to reestablish that tradition and that feeling again. Thank you, and let's go to questions. Yes, sir.
A really good presentation. I don't have a
Thank you.
question, but I have a couple comments. So FDR is my favorite president.
Could you please try to talk a little louder, sir? I'm sorry.
I know a lot about FDR.
Yes.
If you read those messages that I haven't read before, he started burning before burning. And he won 4 elections. It's just incredible. Just incredible.
I know.
Those were powerful messages.
Yes, and he knows to return to the same big themes again and again and again. And that's something else that has changed that makes me very sad. Harry Truman, for instance, had a terrible time domestically with Congress, his whole presidency. But, okay, in the fall of 1945, he proposed national health insurance for everybody. The American Medical Association was so powerful and so opposed to it that it never even came to a vote in either house of Congress. But he continued to propose it every year. Again, Bill Clinton tried health care, it went nowhere, and he gave it up, basically. Because Truman continued to propose it every year, eventually we got Medicare. We're still waiting for the whole thing, but that was progress. So that is another form of presidential leadership, is just to keep things in the public eye. Yes?
Do you think that Reagan's statement that the government was the problem is a very important factor in our current trajectory that leads us to where we are today?
It absolutely is, and what is chilling is that you can see both Clinton and Obama picking up on that to a certain extent. In fact, Clinton's 1996 State of the Union message is a real masterpiece of triangulation. And he said in that address, "We have learned that government is not the solution and government is not the problem. We are the solution." So you see, he was triangulating it. And Obama told some jokes in annual addresses about the inefficiency of the federal government, that one agency is responsible for salmon and saltwater, and one agency is responsible for salmon and freshwater, and it really gets complicated when they're canned. Ha 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 ha. So, yeah, I mean, there is no question that was a turning point. But that he, like FDR, had tapped into something very big. Yes?
One more question.
Sure.
Considering all of FDR's addresses, whether they're fireside chats, inaugural State of the Union, how would you rank the first top 2 or 3 in terms of their historical significance?
Oh. Well, I think certainly that first inaugural, to me, and again, we all know there's nothing to fear but fear itself. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Yes, but there was this whole moral critique. Again, something Obama did not do. He flirted with it a little, but not in a big way.
What about the first fireside chat about the bank?
Yes, but that is because it lays out what he's going to be doing. In the same way that the first fireside chat after the war begins lays out how long it's going to take. The 1941 State of the Union address, I think, is very important. Yeah. But they all just build on each other, and that's part of his greatness. So that's why I think it's difficult to single out one. Yeah. Yes?
Talk about the State of the Union address in general.
Yes.
It's my understanding that Washington did his personally and Adams, and then Jefferson didn't go to Congress. He submitted it.
That's right.
And that remained until Wilson.
That's right.
Why do you think no one in that period thought about why not go back to in person, have a bigger stage, and why did Wilson?
Well, I can't answer that question, but I do want to say, as the person who wrote this book, Wilson did a great thing. One of the things that happened after they stopped going to Congress was they got longer and longer and longer. And thus, let me see if I can find this quickly. and Teddy Roosevelt was the worst. And I mentioned, this is around page 190 of the book, okay? Yeah. And I said, Roosevelt's addresses got longer and longer, so that the last one was X words. I said, that is about 1/3 of the length of this book up until this point. It really was gigantic. So Wilson decided to give it in Congress in person, also cut it to a fraction of its length. And by that time in my labors, I was really ready to throw my arms around him and give him a great big kiss for that. But it did make it much more effective. But and of course, that's just before radio has come in, which of course changes everything. Although I'm not sure what the first one to be broadcast was. It was probably Coolidge or Hoover or something like that, but I should have run that down, but I didn't. Yeah. Yeah.
Was it controversial when Mr. Wilson decided to go to Congress in person, or?
Well, he was riding a wave, because remember, this is only the second time the Democrats have been in since the Civil War, and he has this whole messianic flavor to him anyway. He's sure he's doing the Lord's work. I mean, I've got to say, by the way, American history is full of paradoxes, and we don't have any taste for paradox anymore. And Wilson and Andrew Jackson, to me, exemplify that. I mean, yes, Andrew Jackson was a slave owner. We know about his Indian policies, although they were not unique, and that comes out in the book. But Andrew Jackson also, in vetoing the Bank of the United States charter, renewal of the charter, that speech could have come right out of the mouths of Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. It's amazing. And he is the first and the last president for a long time to talk that way. And as for Wilson, yes, he was a serious racist who imposed racist policy, although he never talked about it. But he is a great visionary, and his struggle to try to stop the First World War, to try to find some alternative to going into it, is heroic. And also, he gave the Peace Without Victory speech in January 1917, calling on the European powers to make peace. And he predicts exactly what's going to happen. He says, if this is fought out to the finish, there'll be more bitterness, more division, more war. It's got to end in a negotiated peace, which in the end, of course, it didn't, with exactly the consequences he predicted. So, yeah, we don't elect saints, okay, but we elect sinners who can also do great things, frequently, yes.
If I may, is it my understanding that the Monroe Doctrine is somewhere buried in President Monroe's annual message to the point where people didn't even realize what he was proposing?
No, I can't believe that. It is a centerpiece of that message, and I don't see how anybody could miss it. Yeah, right, yes.
This is a personal question. As a college professor, you critique students presenting something. You're now listening to a message of the president existing right now. Do you have an urge to yell, what? Or what are you saying? Or what is your reaction to the president? Don't pick any speech note, but how do you react to something you're hearing live?
How do I react to it?
Yeah, I'm just curious. I yell, what? Or my wife says, you shouldn't.
No, I try to keep my cool and I try to be analytical, but we're in a great crisis of presidential communication, okay? The fireside chats were a big step forward, and that gave way to the televised presidential address. And actually, without question, I think, again, I had to reevaluate a lot of things for this book. The greatest master of the televised presidential address was Nixon, who sold the country on his Vietnam policy step by step, and who, as a result of that, in January 1973, was on top of the world, in a position to establish a tremendous record, and threw it all away over Watergate, which really is, you could argue, is just as tragic as what happened to Johnson. And believe me, I was taught to hate Nixon all my life, and I did, but I emerged with some grudging respect. For instance, Nixon's first inaugural, it's very clear he had the whole idea of détente with the Soviet Union and China in his head at that time. It's all there in the first inaugural. And he followed up, again, he was strategic. But now, Biden never gives a televised address, except for the State of the Union. The State of the Union itself, it seems to me, more than anything else, it's become an exercise in rallying your troops in Congress. So we sit there watching the in-party members get up every sentence and clap, while the out-party members sit there stony-faced. And we watch one president after another bring in these average citizens in the gallery as props for whatever point they want to make, and it's not what it used to be. But the other thing that really shocks me, I mean, I still get the New York Times delivered every day, and when Biden makes a statement, it shows up on page 812 or somewhere like that. Whereas anytime FDR made a statement, it was on page 1. And that's where it ought to be, because I got news for you. The president's opinion, whoever he is more important than anybody else's. Yep.
All right, great, thank you.
Well, thank you.